One winter morning, security cameras from a nearby highway checkpoint captured a lone figure trudging through the snow. His name was Daniel Harper, a former U.S. Army Ranger. The kind of man who'd seen battlefields most of us couldn't even imagine. He carried an empty M4 slung across his chest and a limp in his step, as if every mile was carved into his bones. Survivors later testified that he had been searching for his wife, missing since the early days of the outbreak. He wasn't looking for food, not for shelter, he was looking for answers. According to a report filed by a scavenger who stumbled upon his camp, Daniel left behind scraps of military rations, neat rows of sharpened sticks, and even a crude perimeter alarm made of tin cans. This was a man who knew survival. But when he reached Pine Hollow and crossed paths with Ethan, something shifted. Witnesses recall hearing a muffled shot. Not lethal, tranquilizer. The boy had knocked out a soldier. Just think about that for a second. A 12-year-old outmaneuvered a trained ranger. When Daniel woke up inside the villa, he found himself staring at the strangest form of survival ingenuity, a treadmill wired into an old generator, powering the lights. The children had turned physical exhaustion into electricity. To me, that's both heartbreaking and brilliant. A reminder of how kids adapt when the world no longer plays fair. But the real horror lay in what Daniel uncovered next. In the basement, he discovered a locked steel door. Behind it, the walls were shredded with claw marks, some deep enough to gouge the concrete. Forensic analysts who later examined fragments of skin caught in the grooves said the DNA didn't match any known living person. Half human, half something else. Ethan finally confessed. His father, once a government biologist, had experimented with a virus meant to repair failing hearts. Instead, it created what Daniel would come to know as the special infected humans who healed faster, fought harder, but carried the curse of losing control in fits of primal rage. And this is where my own unease grows. Because every survivor's account agrees on one detail. Ethan didn't tell this story with fear. He told it with composure, like a boy explaining his bedtime routine. That kind of calm in the face of monstrosity makes me wonder, did Ethan still see himself as a child? Or had he already accepted that he was something else entirely? But Daniel's discovery was only the beginning. Because once you peel back the first layer of horror, the true cost of survival begins to show. And for Ethan, that cost was about to tear his family apart. Which brings us to the darkest nights of Pine Hollow, when frenzy and survival collided. Imagine waking up before dawn, your body already sore from the day before. You grab a piece of bread, kiss your family goodbye, and step into the black mouth of a mine. For the next 14 hours, this is your world: darkness, dust, and the echo of pickaxes striking stone. In the 19th century, this was the daily life of countless miners. They worked in tunnels so narrow that sometimes you had to crawl on your hands and knees, your back permanently bent by the low ceilings. What strikes me the most is not just the length of the day, but the silence. Down there, the air was heavy, filled with coal dust that choked your lungs. Yet conversations were rare. Every man knew that too much noise could mask the sound of danger. A crack in the wall, a rumble above your head, the warning that the earth was about to collapse. I often wonder, how did they endure this? Day after day, year after year? Maybe it was the promise of a warm meal waiting at home. Or simply the knowledge that without this job, their families would have nothing at all. I think about what 14 hours underground really means. It means leaving the sunlight when it is still rising and returning only when it is gone. It means never seeing your children play outside in the afternoon. It means trading your health, your very breath, for the chance to keep bread on the table. And that is a reality I find both heartbreaking and humbling. Yet this was only the beginning of their struggle. Because even after surviving 14 hours in the darkness, miners faced another brutal truth. The pay they received barely reflected the risks they took. And that brings us to the next part of this story. Would it truly cost to earn a single dollar a day? After 14 hours underground, you might expect a miner to come home with enough money to feel at least a little secure.
Just another day,
but the truth is shocking. In the 19th century, the average wage for a day's work in the mines was only about $1. $1 for 14 hours in choking dust, for the risk of broken bones or worse. And when you adjust that for today, it is roughly $30. Can you imagine risking your life every day for the price of a cheap dinner in modern America? Many miners lived in company-owned towns where that single dollar didn't even go far. They had to buy food, clothing, and even coal for their own stoves from stores owned by the mining company itself. Prices were inflated, debts piled up, and it often felt like the harder you worked, the deeper you sank. There's an old saying from the time, "I owe my soul to the company store." And sadly, it wasn't just a song lyric, it was a reality. I often think about how a father must have felt, handing his wife a single coin after a day that nearly crushed him. Maybe he tried to smile. Maybe he said, "It's enough for bread and a little meat tonight." But deep inside, he knew it was never truly enough. What kind of courage does it take to go back down the next morning, knowing the reward for your suffering is so small? To me, that speaks of a quiet strength, a resilience that is hard to put into words. But even that meager dollar was not guaranteed. Because in the mines, danger was constant. Explosions, collapsing tunnels, or invisible clouds of toxic gas could wipe away a man's future in seconds. And when tragedy struck, families often received nothing at all. Which leads us to the next, even darker part of their story, the disasters that struck again and again, stealing lives faster than the mines could pay them. If earning just $1 a day wasn't cruel enough, miners also lived with the constant shadow of death. In some coal regions of Pennsylvania, records show that by the late 19th century, mines experienced on average 3 serious accidents every single month. Imagine living in a community where nearly every week, someone you knew didn't come back from work. The threats came in many forms. Methane gas could ignite with the smallest spark, turning the tunnels into a fireball. Walls of rock could give way without warning, crushing men in silence. Even the air itself was a killer. Carbon monoxide poisoning left workers dizzy, gasping, and often unconscious before they ever realized something was wrong. And in the darkness, when one man fell, his comrades often had only seconds to decide whether to rush in and try to save him, or run before the mine claimed them too. I sometimes picture a wife waiting at the door of her small wooden house, eyes fixed on the path that led from the mine. Every time the bell rang in the town square to signal an accident, her heart must have stopped. Was it her husband this time? Her brother? Her child? That constant fear, living not just with poverty, but with the knowledge that any day could be the last, creates a kind of courage I find almost impossible to imagine. What makes it even more haunting is that children were not spared from these dangers. Many of the young boys who worked in or around the mines faced the same risks. Their small hands blackened with coal dust long before they were old enough to dream of another life. And that leads us to the next chapter of this story, how childhood itself was stolen by the mines, and how the price of survival was paid not only by men, but by children as young as 8 years old. As if the dangers for grown men weren't enough, nearly 1 in 5 miners in the 19th century was a child. Some were as young as 8 years old, hired as breaker boys. Their job was to sit on wooden benches above conveyor belts, picking slate and stones out of coal with their bare hands. Hour after hour, their tiny fingers bled, their clothes were soaked with dust, and their lungs filled with black soot before they had even learned to write their names properly. I can almost picture them, thin, tired faces smeared with coal, coughing between shifts, yet still managing to laugh with one another in the brief moments of rest. They weren't playing with marbles or running through fields. Their playground was a mine. Their toys were jagged rocks, and their childhood slipped away with every lump of coal that passed through their hands. What moves me most is the silence of it all. These children had no choice. Families were so poor that every pair of hands, no matter how small, meant another loaf of bread on the table. I sometimes imagine a boy watching his father leave for the deep tunnels while he himself stayed at the breaker line. Did he feel proud to help? Or did he quietly dream of escaping this fate? Perhaps both. And that is what makes their stories so human, caught between love for family and the loss of everything a childhood should have been. It's easy for us to feel outraged now. But back then, this was normal. Communities accepted it, and the children themselves often thought there was no other life waiting for them. Yet in the darkness of the mines, something else began to grow, a sense of solidarity. A bond of survival that would one day fuel entire movements for change. And that brings us to the next part of the story, the hidden brotherhood of the miners. And how even in the blackest tunnels, they found ways to sing, to pray, and to stand together. For all the hardship and danger, miners discovered something extraordinary beneath the ground: each other. In the suffocating darkness, they formed bonds that were stronger than iron. When the walls groaned and the air filled with dust, a man's only hope was the hand of his fellow miner pulling him to safety.
Please.
Down there, they weren't just co-workers, they were brothers. I imagine the small rituals they created to survive. A shared song echoing through the tunnels, keeping rhythm with their hammers. A whispered prayer before lighting a lamp, hoping it would not spark an explosion. Even the simplest gesture, a piece of bread passed during a break, a nod of encouragement, became lifelines. These were not grand acts, but they carried immense weight in a place where every day might be your last. What strikes me is how humanity refuses to vanish. Even in the harshest conditions, the miners built a culture of solidarity. They celebrated births and mourned deaths together, often right at the mine's entrance. They told stories, passed down songs, and in doing so, gave meaning to a life that might otherwise have been only suffering. When I think about it, this brotherhood was their greatest treasure, not the coal they dug, but the unbreakable bond that kept them going. And it was this very sense of unity that would one day rise to the surface. It fueled strikes, inspired demands for justice, and gave ordinary men the courage to challenge powerful companies. The brotherhood forged in the mines did not end underground. It became the spark of a larger fight. Which leads us to the final part of this story: the legacy these miners left behind, and how their sacrifice shaped the labor rights we know today. The story of 19th-century miners does not end in darkness. Out of their sweat, their pain, and their brotherhood, something remarkable was born. The constant injustice, 14-hour shifts, $1 wages, children with blackened lungs, ignited a fire that spread far beyond the tunnels. These miners, once seen as powerless, began to stand together in ways no company could ignore. By the early 20th century, their voices rose in strikes and rallies. Men who had once whispered songs underground now shouted for fair pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. It is because of them that the 8-hour workday became law. That children were finally pulled from the mines and given back their childhoods. And that workers everywhere gained the right to demand dignity. To me, this is the most inspiring part of the story. That unimaginable suffering was transformed into lasting change. When I think about it, I see more than coal dust and poverty. I see courage passed from one generation to the next. I see ordinary people who refused to stay silent, whose unity became the foundation of the labor rights we benefit from today. And I can't help but feel grateful. Every time I finish work at a reasonable hour, every time I see a child in school instead of on a factory floor, I know it is because miners paid the price long before us. Their legacy is not just written in history books. It lives in the very rhythm of our daily lives. And that is why their secret world matters, even now, because when we remember them, we also remember that change is possible, even in the darkest of places. So, what do you think? Would you have had the strength to face the mines, day after day? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy uncovering these hidden stories of the past, give me a like, subscribe, and share this video. Together, we can keep these voices from being forgotten.